Hi, I'm Nicole Myers. I'm the Barbara Thomas Lemmon Senior Curator of European Art. We're so glad that you've all joined us here today for this panel discussion with two of our wonderful conservators at the DMA. So I'm going to let my panelists introduce themselves.
Hi, I am Laura Hartman, the paintings conservator.
Hi, I'm Elena Torok. I'm the Assistant Objects Conservator.
So for the reinstallation of the European art galleries, I was really interested in reassessing the collection that we have and looking at things that have been kept in storage, some of them for quite some time. They just hadn't been brought out or put on view because I wanted to rethink the stories that we could tell on level 2. Some of these works, like the 16th century painting, A St. Jerome in the Wilderness by Harry Mette Blaise, or now Gobbo's constructed head from the early 20th century, had condition issues, whether they were structural or aesthetic. And these were things that we discussed together really at length to determine whether, in fact, we could include them in the galleries. So my first question for both of you is, how do you determine whether an object needs conservation treatment?
So, I think for paintings and for objects, there's some similarities and some differences. In terms of paintings, we look at structural issues as well as aesthetic condition. So a painting can look great, but the actual support can sometimes need work. So you really have to look at the front and the back of a painting to determine its overall stability. Sometimes paintings have very yellowed varnishes. They haven't been on view for a long time. So we bring them up to the studio and do a full examination before consulting with our curatorial colleagues to determine what steps we want to take or need to be taken before a painting can be put on display.
Elena, how about for you?
For objects, it's similar, but I think one of the big things we look at first is just structurally for something three-dimensional. Is it safe to display? Can it stand on its own? Does it have any issues that prevent it from being shown safely, in the gallery? And then just as Laura was saying too, aesthetically, does it have old repairs that might compromise its appearance? Does it look like it did, as the artist intended it to? And it's usually a discussion with our curator and our team on if it does have a condition issue, is it possible for us to address it in a way that does make it safe for display and does allow us to bring it out for view?
Yeah, I mean, that was definitely an issue for the Gobbo, of course, where there were both aesthetic and structural concerns, as well as for the Blaise painting. So walk me through this. What is the process from the moment that I come to one of you and I say, I really love this object and it can't go on view the way that it appears right now? Walk me through the steps of what it takes to get it gallery ready.
So we first go look at the work in storage to make sure that it's stable enough to even come up to the studio. And luckily it was. So we brought the painting up to the conservation studio. And the first thing I did was simply look at it under the microscope, image it, take an X-ray, understand the Bless is painted on wood. So I needed to understand if the wood support was stable, and what that might. Luckily for us, the support was very stable, and we were able to remove years and years of grime and varnish, very dark varnish, an old restoration, and the varnish actually was rather easy to remove. It was a natural resin varnish. It came quite easily. And once that sort of film came off, you could really see the beautiful painting underneath. And we knew Bless as a miniature painter and as a landscape painter, but when you see his work up close, remarkable. The landscape is beautiful, but you really start seeing tiny details that were hidden under the lens of the varnish. And so, along with the treatment, we were consistently doing quite a bit of archival research to better understand Bless as a painter, the condition it was in, what had happened to it in the past. The restoration that was on it was very likely much older, from the 19th century, early 20th century. And at that point, whoever had cleaned it had damaged the surface quite a bit in certain areas. And so we did have to do some retouching to reconstruct those losses, which were luckily small and sort of in specific areas in the composition. So we did quite a bit of archival research and were able to complete the retouching more sympathetically. And then we put a varnish on it, and it just looked gorgeous, I have to say. And we were able to really see Bless as a painter, because when it was in storage, you really just passed by. You had no idea that it was anything other than a dirty landscape painting. But I'm happy that we brought it up to the studio and were able to really spend time getting to know the painting and see all of those tiny details that are available to the general audience at the museum.
Well, you did a beautiful job. I mean, Blez is an artist that I knew and could see and hope for at least the potential in our picture. So it was really thrilling for you to be able to bring that back, and for us to be able to enjoy it now in the galleries is just incredible. So Elena, you did an equally transformational treatment on the Gobbo. What was that like? Again, from the moment I said there's this work, and I already knew it to have both structural and major aesthetic issues. Is this possible to put it on view? Because I would really love to be able to do that.
So Gobbo's constructed head number 2 is made from an early plastic called ivory rhodoid. We know that it's a trade name for either a cellulose acetate or a cellulose nitrate, and we're still doing some material testing on that. But part of the key in understanding its condition and its treatment is to know a lot about, you know, these particular types of materials and how they age. So early plastics, you know, around the beginning of the 20th century, there were a lot of artists using what were new materials in their work. They, you know, kind of enabled for making things in ways that, you know, were brand new as well. And unfortunately, some of the ones from the early 20th century have proven that they don't age so well. We know about ours actually has changed color over time. It would have been a bright white, or at least a bit of a brighter white when it was first made, and now it's started to yellow. And also because of what it's made from and because of how it's constructed, I mean, it's a constructivist work, so the joints are very fragile and only kind of connected at the ends. It makes it susceptible to, it's very fragile as well. So over time,
there are multiple pieces of plastic, is that right, in terms of how he actually fitted them together to make the head?
This is a constructivist form that Gobbo revisited many times over the course of his career. The first version of this piece, constructed head number 2, was made in 1916 from metal. And he did multiple versions and enlargements. The last one was just a few years before he died, an enlargement that's actually in the collection of the Nasher next door. Our version is the only one that he made in plastic. And so it's rare. We're incredibly lucky to own it. And we're incredibly lucky that it's in the condition that it's in. Part of that is due to the fact that so when early plastics age very differently, you know, depending on their composition and depending on how they're cared for over time. This piece in Gobbo's ownership for his entire life. We acquired it a few years after he passed away. He died in 1977, and it came into our collection in 1981. it's been in the museum collection ever since. So it's been cared for. We also know from doing a bit of scientific analysis that it contains certain pigments that just coincidentally have worked to offset the degradation mechanisms of the plastic itself. So we are happy that he chose that particular color. We are happy that it's been cared for. But we do know it's got a bit of a long history of structural repair to it. So we know that there is a repair, at least one by Gobbo. There is one by his brother, the artist Antoine Pevsner. And it was also received a major repair just before it entered our collection from Charles Wilson, who was his longtime studio assistant, and has repaired many, many of his works. So the thing is, with these different adhesives, adhesives change over time. They change in appearance, and especially when they're up against a plastic that might be actively deteriorating, it'll cause that degradation of the adhesive even faster. So
what was the purpose of the adhesive?
The adhesive was applied to strengthen the joins between, so there are lots of little joins. Gobbo originally would have made these joins with just a solvent, so applied solvent to the end and then stuck them together, which is a way to join plastics, but it's not very strong. So, and his working methods changed over time as well, and a lot of his materials he used in repair are documented as well, but an adhesive would have made that joint a little bit stronger. And when it was first applied, it would have been clear. The thing is, over time, adhesives brown and they yellow, and now we have a lot of materials that age much better and discolor much more slowly. But at the time that, this was last repaired in 1981, so it's been nearly 40 years. So the adhesive was discolored. So against a translucent material, those old repairs were very much noticeable. Glues also, as they start to break down, the first thing you see is that discoloration, but it's also making them less structurally stable. So if you see a browned adhesive, it usually means that it's not doing the same kind of structural holding as you need it to. So, and that was the case with this piece as well. There were some joins that were starting to fail. We knew when we saw it that we wanted to reduce the appearance of this discolored adhesive, so the piece looked more like it was supposed to, and this was not the first thing that stuck out. But of course, doing that has to be done very carefully and very slowly. And we were incredibly lucky. We know a lot about the piece's history because Charles was very generous with his time and spoke with us about his work. And we also spoke with Dr. Stephen Nash, who was the curator at the time this piece came into the collection. And so we are incredibly fortunate to know a lot about both the history of the object and the history of its repairs.
I think it's also, for me, important to note that, when I approached it aesthetically, these discolored joins, this discolored glue was so distracting that I didn't know that we would put it on view if it wasn't something that we could reduce. Because again, what we hope to always show with the art in the galleries is the artist's intent, as close as we can honor that. And that was the big question, beyond the stability, which is number one, so important, but what can we do so that Gobbo, if he were to come into the galleries today, would be pleased to see the work. And I think you did an incredible job, both ensuring that the work is really stable. I think we can't express enough how fragile the piece is. He basically built a house of cards with thin sheets of plastic in the 1920s. And you go and see it now in the galleries, and it is just radiant and translucent, and I think really reflects what the artist had hoped to capture. So that, again, we don't see the work that either of you put into the painting or the sculpture, even though it was about a year in the making for both pieces behind the scenes. But that's exactly, of course, I know what you're aiming to do, is to have people really focus on the artwork. But, with the Gobbo, it leads an interesting question, because the object, of course, is still fragile, even if it's stable. So how does the condition of an object like that affect the decision of how we then were able to present it in the galleries?
That's a good question. We talked a lot beforehand. So we know that the piece is still actively off-gassing. It's happening at a much slower rate now that it's in good environmental conditions, and it does have, I mean, you can tell when you get close to it, it's got a vinegar smell. And with those types of materials, you don't want those off-gassing materials to be in close, if they're kept in close contact with the work itself, it'll just speed up the degradation. So it's important to have enough air exchange for pieces like these. The thing is, when you're in a gallery situation, and this is a relatively small piece, you still want your visitors to be able to safely approach it and view it and see it. So we designed a case. We worked with our design team, our mount makers, our preparators, our curators. It was to talk about the best way to do this. And the case actually looks very similar to other cases in the gallery. But if you look closely, you'll see there's some holes that have been drilled through for air exchange. So the pollutants are able to kind of flow out. And we open the case pretty regularly, actually every few weeks, to just allow for a few more air exchanges. And that's what's safest for. So having it under a vitrine is safest for its display in the gallery, and designing the vitrine in this way is safest for the piece itself. So the last thing we want to do is put something out and then have its appearance change over time just by being on display. So we've been able to design something so that doesn't happen. One thing that has actually, I mean, with the museum closure, this activity is something that we've needed to keep up with. So Laura and I are both on the museum's art care team, who is still entering the building for essential functions only. This is most certainly an essential function. So every few weeks, we are going in with a vacuum and doing a bit of a modified version of this, and the way to do it safely and by ourselves as well, so it doesn't involve a team of people going in, but pushing air through this case and making sure that it's still filtering as it needs to while we can't be there with it every day.
I want to take a moment to thank you both, as well as other conservators, of course, at the museum and our collections care team, and for going in and continuing to care for our collection during this time when the doors are shut. The art is there and it is still loved and getting the attention that you would normally be giving it. So I think it's a wonderful thing that it's there waiting for us for when we can all go back to enjoy it. So Laura, I know the issues with paintings can often be a bit different in terms of the condition affecting display. How is that? You know, what type of considerations then, once you've treated the work of art, might inform, you know, how I'm able to display it?
Following up on the blast, for example, not only was its condition compromised when we found it in storage, it was also in a pretty terrible frame, I have to say. The frame was not original. It was falling apart, and just did nothing for the painting. So when we brought the work up and decided to undertake a year-long treatment, it was with the understanding that we would not put it back in that terrible frame, that we would either exhibit it without a frame or find a frame for exhibition. Frames are hugely important to paintings. Sometimes they are actually integral to the work itself. Sometimes they were chosen by the artist, and they're incredibly important to a work. For the Bless, we ended up actually putting a modern frame on it until we can find a historic or a historically appropriate frame for it. But I think it looks great in the frame that we chose. So framing is a huge conversation with our curatorial colleagues. We also have to consider, for example, if the painting's on a unstable support. So sometimes artists would paint on wood panels, and wood can warp and move. We also have to make decisions on display parameters? Do we need to put the work in a microclimate envelope, which is basically a glazing system within the frame that keeps a stable environment? Do we glaze the work or do we not glaze the work? So that's the glass or plexi in a work of art. And glazing is a protective measure, but for especially dark paintings, it can also really obscure our ability to see a work of art. So it's always a compromise. So these are some of the things that really go into the conversations before a work goes up in the galleries. What kind of varnish do we put on? Do we varnish a painting, especially when we're talking about impressionist works? And the lighting, especially if the work has pigments that are fragile or can discolor with light. So there's a lot that goes into the display. Even though it seems like it's flat and two-dimensional, there really is a lot that goes into the conversations around display for paintings.
I always love those conversations with the both of you, because you learn, for me, I get to learn so much about the pieces, about their materials, about their past, about their condition history. I think a lot of people always want to know, how does one become a conservator? So I would love for both of you to talk a bit about, what your background is. What was your education? How did you become a conservator?
I actually got into it in a really strange path. I think Elena did too, but we could not have more different backgrounds, I think. I actually came into it because I was a painter and was really interested in historic materials and techniques. So I was making a lot of paintings, making my own pigment. I was already sort of on the art history track. And then I added on the chemistry, thinking I might do material science to study paint and pigment, and just basically materials. And that led me to conservation. So after that, I did my undergrad in art history and chemistry, double majored, and then got into the graduate program at the University of Delaware and was able to sort of follow through, always knowing that I would be a paintings person. I never looked that way, but I know Elena had a very different path to conservation.
Yeah, I came more from the science side of things, and I think what's so amazing about our field is that it's so interdisciplinary. I mean, everybody, all conservators kind of need to have the fundamental background in art history and science, but kind of where everybody's experience comes from is really different in very cool ways. I came through to the field through science, so I went to the College of William and Mary and was a neuroscience major there. And I think the only reason I chose that is because I could take as many sciences, sort of take lots of different sciences at the same time. And I had a minor in combined art and art history that was just always an interest. And it was a college professor my junior year who told me, was the first one to say, like, have you considered a career in conservation? Because there is a way to combine all of these interests. And I think it was something that once I learned existed, kind of went towards, without hesitation or looking back. I also went to the same graduate program that Laura did at the Winterthur University of Delaware. There are not very many graduate programs in the United States for this field. We are very, very small. And when you go to grad school, you get a training sort of in a general training in all materials. And then, like Laura was saying, you choose a specialization. So I've always loved 3D objects. I like being able to work on something different, every day. I can, in a span of a week, I might be working on a contemporary piece or an archaeological object or, anything in between. And I really love that about objects conservation specifically.
So I would love to repeat for everybody who is listening that the separation between conservation and curatorial. We all study art history, but it's science. There was a moment when I too was interested in going into conservation. I always had an interest in fine arts, was a good academic, and thought, well, maybe I can combine the two, but it is the science that separated me out. So kudos to you two for being able to combine the both, because it's definitely not easy. I think it might come as a surprise to people to know, in fact, that you guys do train also as art historians. How does that art historical knowledge inform the conservation work that you do?
I actually, my undergrad was in art history, and I was really fortunate in my graduate studies to also be able to take art history with fabulous people like Perry Chapman, for example, at the University of Delaware. But it plays a huge role, and I think it plays a huge role across the board. But in paintings conservation, I'm biased, but in paintings conservation, it plays an especially large role. We have really started in the last couple of years working very closely with our curatorial counterparts in the field of what now is called technical art history, where we have a lot of technology available to us to really research paintings and look at the compositions, the paint, the stratigraphy of the paint layers, how the artist worked, and we're able to apply that to the history and really make connections between the sciences and the art historians. So working with curators like Nikki, who are interested in technical art history, is a huge benefit and a great collaboration, because we can sort of intermingle the two very beautifully as we look at paintings and do the research.
And for you, Elena?
Like Laura was saying, we're always working to learn more about the art historical side of what we do. But I really like, actually, at the DMA specifically, because we are an encyclopedic collection, and we have our curatorial department has grown so much just in this past year too. There are so many colleagues and experts in these fields that we're able to learn a lot from as well. And so it helps inform our research, as we get started on things, as we start moving forward. It's hugely important to have that connection and have as much information at the table as you can when you start. So it's been just like an absolute pleasure to work with so many different people from so many different art historical backgrounds on all of these different projects. It makes the work that we do even easier and better. So,
but even with something like going back to the European galleries, there were a lot of pretty complicated projects. The Bless, for example, again, we really needed to do quite a bit of art history research into his. He was a painter that really repeated motifs. And like I was saying earlier, there were some areas of abrasion where not only did we have to look at our own available technology, like red images, to help us with the retouching phase of treatment, we also looked at his own catalog of paintings, and we were able to really reconstruct those areas based on the art history research and looking back to understand his painting technique and workshop.
I mean, for me, that's one of the things I love most about being a curator and being a curator at a museum that has a great conservation department. Because for me personally, as you mentioned, Laura, the technical aspect of art history really informs the work that I do. I'm really interested, as you both know, in artistic process, and how artists made paintings and sculpture, from the materials they selected, to how they use them, and how ultimately that informs what we see on the surface today. So, for example, we have a show coming up on Wang Gri's Cuba Still Lifes. And I wrote an essay that really explores Wangri's artistic practice, and it was completely inspired by the painting that we have in our collection, Guitar and Pipe, from 1913, that Laura and I spent a lot of time looking at well before that became the subject of the essay that I wrote for the forthcoming publication, of really thinking about how does an artist go from blank slate to the picture that we see. If it's a painting, for example, the image on the surface. And the question was really sparked by how unique our painting is, in that it is one of the only pictures in his entire body of work where he actually exposes that process. He did these really intricate charcoal underdrawings on the canvas and then would paint over. But in our picture, he left a lot of these, what I call windows, open. And it gives a glimpse and it makes you think different types of questions. And what I found the most interesting is that on the art history side and the literature, we have Gris also to blame for this. There has just been a lot of theories talking about how he comes up with these amazing cubist images. But what I found really striking in the scholarship of the art historians writing about Gris is that nobody had ever tested the theories, whether Gris or anybody else's, against the actual art object. And so that became the nugget of a study around our picture that I was able to expand out to other works in his production, because I was really curious then to know, well, how did that change? We have an early work from beginning to end. Both of you know, too, that in recent years, I've become really interested in how materials age, and how that impacts not only its stability, but its appearance. So, for example, pigment analysis is a huge part of the research that we've been conducting on the Van Gogh paintings in our collection. Also, in relation to an exhibition that we're working on with Van Gogh, he was, known to use these incredibly fugitive red pigments that he mixed with white to make pink, blue to make purple, yellow to make orange, and so on. And these pigments have completely faded and disappeared today. We are learning with every passing week and month that with Van Gogh's work, the litany of books that have been written about his use of color, his color schemes, his color theories are actually incorrect, because of course they're based on what the paintings look like today. But we're understanding more and more through conservation research, through scientific analysis, that in fact there have been great shifts that really do impact not just what we see, but how we think about the artists. So these are things that excite me on a personal level, but maybe also because I feel like in studying how the artwork was made, it really personalizes both the object, but also the artist. I mean, it really forces you to remember that at the end of the day, every artwork is the result of myriad choices, even things that seem random. Even this drip of paint, the artist selected the color. So it forces us to really consider what the artist intended, what they wanted us to see, but to think about what it is that we actually see today. So I find that space in between the
And
two.
it's definitely always a compromise. We were saying earlier, we want the object or painting to look as close to the artist's original intent, but a caveat to that is that we actually have to consider a myriad of historic facts about the painting and try and come to point in the actual aesthetic of the work that harmonizes not only the artist's intent but also the history of the object. So especially I think with pigment, that's a huge issue in conversation. So even things like our Reynolds. So Reynolds paintings are notorious for discoloring. Painters in the sort of turn in that moment at the turn of the century who had all of these new materials available were even writing artist books talking about how, oh, that pigment will discolor, but it looks so good right now that may as well use it. So you do have sort of this archival information about how artists chose materials, their knowledge of the changes or potential changes. So looking at a more technical research avenue like artist manuals and artist journals will really give you a sense of how aware they were of these changes. And I think Van Gogh is a really great example because he wrote so much that we really get a lens into his choice as a painter.
100%. I'm going to ask you a question that is, I think, often very hard to answer, but, I've just mentioned about what I love most about working with conservation. So I'm going to ask you, what do you love most about being conservators in an art museum? What is it that makes you the most excited when you're in the lab?
I like just that every new treatment, every new project that I get to work on, I'm learning something new. I think conservation is a field where no matter how long you're in it, I mean, I think this is the way with a lot of museum careers, but conservation is amazing in that I will never know all there is to know about materials, about artists, about tech. So every new project, I'm learning something completely different from a completely different time period, from a completely different artist, work of art, things like that. And that just makes it such a joy to do. I mean, you're constantly learning new information. So it's great.
I love getting to know one collection really thoroughly. So even for the European galleries, we made so many discoveries about paintings, not only things that we found in storage that ended up being remarkable, like the Bless, but things that were on our walls already that needed treatment, that hadn't been treated in a very long time, or new acquisitions that we were able to clean before we exhibited them in the gallery room. So I think it's a privilege to be a conservator in one collection because you are the person that knows every little detail about each work.
Laura, I'm going to ask you to go back because you were breaking up when you were talking about new acquisitions. So I'm going to remind you where you were, if you don't mind, because I think that was a nice thing to talk about. So you were talking about getting to know a collection and that you had treated many things on level 2, things that had been on view that maybe needed to, have been, it was time to have a treatment. But then you were also talking about recent acquisitions. And, we debuted level 2 with over 40 new acquisitions, most of which were paintings. So, in terms of the work that you do to prepare, you're talking about your favorite things. What is it about the new acquisitions that excites you?
New acquisitions are always exciting because, first of all, we have fabulous curators that find these amazing things to bring into the collection, and they really fill in gaps and expand the galleries, but give us an opportunity to either treat or examine and research something new. So, for example, one of my favorite discoveries, and it's small, but when we acquired the Daubigny, for example, we when it arrived, it had a very brown, very brown varnish. And I have to say, this was your first. I think this was your first acquisition, and a great one. So it had a very brown varnish that we had to clean, and Daubigny is notorious for using very difficult materials for conservators to clean. So he often mixes resins into his paints, which makes taking varnishes off very difficult. So I was able to come up with a modern cleaning technique to safely remove this very brown varnish. But when we did a technical examination, we actually found that he had added many more ducks that he later painted out. And it's such a small choice that he made, but it's really wonderful to be able to see those tiny details and realize that they were working on this painting in a very personal way. We were also able to examine our new baguette pan that Nikki also wonderfully acquired for the collection. And when we did infrared imaging, which allows us to see the underdrawing, we saw this pretty amazing underdrawing that so represents the artist's hand and workshop. And we made some interesting discoveries in terms of his working method, the object, and that work we did not treat, but just getting to see it, examine it, do a full technical workup was pretty fabulous. And you just learn so much about each object. And we continue with new technology, we continue to learn more and more about each object that we bring into the collection.
I love that you brought up the Daubigny as an example. It's, I think, worth mentioning, of course, that I work as a curator very closely with you, our conservators, before I would ever consider bringing anything into the collection, whether by purchase, whether by gift. And the Daubigny, I knew enough about Daubigny that they can often be described as scary to treat because of how easy it is to remove the browns and the greens that are so soluble. So that was a really big discussion that I had with Laura, and I was very new to the museum. As she mentioned, it was my first acquisition for the museum. And, I remember saying, kind of like when I approached Elena with the Gobbo, I know this is going to be a challenge, and I don't want to bring it in if it's not something that we can bring back closer to, again, the artist's original intent. It's never going to be what it was from the 19th century, but the best that we can do today, because it needed to be cleaned. That much was obvious, but I didn't want to bring in something that we didn't feel that we could restore to a degree that it would be museum quality, worthy to be on the walls and in a safe manner. So that was a big back and forth that we had in deciding to bring that piece in, and a lot of pressure. It made me think of a question that I would sort of love to ask you both too. Like Elena, for example, like with the Gobbo, that was a lot of pressure. You knew that I really wanted to put it on view. The rarity of the piece and how exceptional it is not lost on you, of all people. And you had a time frame. Both of you did. You were working against a real deadline of reopening the galleries. And for the Gobbo in particular, we had to build the pedestal. We had to have the vitrine, the special vitrine made. So there was a lot of planning that went into that. It was on a case with other works. So there were decisions that were made, very early on, with this kind of line drawn in the sand, that we really hoped that these objects would be ready to be redisplayed in a way that everybody felt happy with and comfortable with. What is that like? The pressure that I think you must be under, and also, as the few people in the museum that can touch the art because you can fix the art, but that you're so intimately involved with these pieces in a way that nobody else is, and that I think none of us can really relate to. Of at least how I would feel, the weight of history literally in your hands. How does one work with that?
I think that with discussion around deadlines and display and things like that, I think that what makes our job much easier in this realm is that we have such a great team and such good communication with our team, with our curators. I think that in these preliminary discussions of like, what can we do in this time frame, and if we ever feel like something is not safe, or if we're asked to do something that we don't feel okay about, that we voice it, and it's a discussion, and if that's the decision, it's also like, okay, well, what can we do? Is there a middle ground? Is there a way that this can be shown from one side, or from in a certain set of parameters? So I think it's always important that line of communication remains open, because the biggest goal is that the safety of the artwork. You want things to be shown safely, and so I think that with the Gobbo, we were lucky. We did have plenty of time to do the repair. I know that this is the hard part of exhibition planning as well, where there might be a lot of things that you want to do, and you kind of have to choose and prioritize. And so that's where it's really helpful, all of our discussions with you, knowing what you really wanted shown, and of these major treatments, which ones were most important to include, with the checklist and everything too. I think that's the thing too about just, we were talking a little while ago about what we love about our job and what we love about being conservators. And I think working on an exhibition, I mean, a lot of the work that we do is can be very small. We can spend days sometimes working under a microscope on like the same square centimeter of an object. But the other part of it is the fact that we get to be part of this team and to work with other people to help realize the vision that, maybe started with your department, but to get all of those pieces lined up with everybody else and to put something together that we're really proud of. So, and I think the second floor was a great example of that, where the finished product, I mean, it took such a huge group approach from so many different directions, and it looks incredible now. And I know we're all happy. We're proud to have worked on it and happy with how it turned out. So
I will say too, though, in response to your question, I think it is good to be scared. I think you need to be equal parts confident and scared and to approach a treatment. For me, one of my absolute favorite things is inventing new treatment techniques to be as minimal as possible in my intervention. So I think being cautious and approaching each work thoughtfully is incredibly important, and not be too cavalier, but not be so scared that you also don't finish a project by a deadline. So I think that is really important to keep in mind when you do start a treatment.
I think neither of you, probably out of politeness, have yet to broach the topic, of course, which is how do you manage the expectations of the curator, which may be completely out of sync with what's actually possible or smart or safe to do. How do you navigate that? Because, the curator will come in, and we all have different aesthetics, and our different areas of expertise also have a certain set of standards of what you're accustomed to seeing a modern painting, for example, versus an ancient archaeological, work. But, if we're talking about sort of more modern European artwork, there is a sense of what you would expect to see of certain artists or certain objects, or what we see all around, in the European galleries on the floor. So, I might come in and say, well, this is very discolored. What can we do about this? But you have to both do this dance, I think, of talking about or proposing what you think the treatment could be, but also mitigating, the expected results perhaps of the art historian that may have a different image in their mind of what it's going to look like, after the year-long treatment. How do you navigate
that is exactly why it's so important that curators spend a lot of time in the studio and spend a lot of time with the object with us. And to Elena's point, I think honesty is really important. So I'm not going to lead you on, Nikki.
Never do. You're very honest, which I love.
But I do think that, to your point, research into new treatment techniques is really important, because this does not relate to European, but I have a painting in the studio, a contemporary work that was attacked by a dog. And it took me about 6 months of just developing new treatment techniques to deal with this weird, wacky situation. And it
just
didn't happen.
Everyone out there not attacked by a dog at the DMA. I want to make it very clear.
It came like that
after the fact.
It came like that. A new acquisition, and we weren't able to exhibit it right away. But after a multi-year project and research, I was able to develop a new treatment tech, which beautifully, and now the work will be able to be displayed. So sometimes it's okay, we can't do this now. Can we hang it the way it looks, or and then treat it once we've developed an appropriate technique, or do we put it in storage or keep it in the studio until we can safely treat it?
Well, and that was a big issue that came up with the Gobbo, because again, we wanted it to be stable for presentation, but for me, the aesthetics were so they really detracted from the strength of the piece. I thought to display it in that condition does not honor the artist at all. And that was a big component of our discussions. And Elena was very, upfront of saying, I don't know how much I can minimize the appearance of this discoloration. And so do you want to speak to that a little bit, or have I?
Yeah. I think sometimes with some treatments, as Laura is saying, it's important to approach things cautiously. And sometimes things, even if it's a material that you worked in before, can behave entirely differently, depending on the work of art. So there's some things that we don't fully know until we do testing, until we get started, until we start. And so I think that when you and I chatted in the very beginning of this, we wanted to kind of go through our full range of expected results and say, like, okay, we can definitely make it look better, but just what we're able to do is going to determine on this wide range of factors. So I think it was, you and I stayed in close contact with everything. I mean, I would do a little test and send you a photo, and we would kind of look at things, and that's what's amazing when you have time and communication ahead of time, where you do have this ability to have this back and forth as you're working as well too. And so I think that we were able to kind of talk about what we wanted, what we hoped for the piece, what we hoped for display, and then over time figure out what of that was possible.
I have to say that was probably one of the most exciting things for me when you were treating the piece. I think I was traveling and you sent me a picture that I wasn't expecting to see, which was actually the results that you were able to achieve overall in the piece that we didn't know would be possible, which is what I had hoped for when we started. So there's moments like that, again, that are just as exciting to me as they are to you when you're making these discoveries, working on these pieces to see what it is that you're uncovering, what it is that you're able to do. That, I'm with you along for the ride, but I think I share, I hope, in your joy as well when the treatments go as well as you anticipate. And, we're really seeing a new aspect of these works of art that have been in the collection for a very long time. Suddenly, it's like we're presenting them brand new once more to our audience, which for me was the thrill, of course, of being able to put these pieces on view in the European galleries, some of which, as you know, haven't been up for decades. So that was a thrill. It's like getting a lot more new acquisitions, in fact, sort of rediscovering the collection in a way that I find really inspiring. So I'm going to thank you both so much for joining me today to talk in depth about yourselves, about your backgrounds, about the work that you do at the museum, and the work that you did to help make the new European galleries so truly spectacular. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Nikki.
Thank you.
It was good to see you both. I hope to see you both soon again at the museum.